Holy Gospel according to Luke. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was altered, and his clothing became dazzling white. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory and spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. Now Peter and those who were with him were heavy with sleep. But when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. And as the men were parting from him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good that we are here. Let us make 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. As he was saying these things, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my Son, my chosen one. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent and told no one in those days anything of what they had seen. The word of the Lord. You may be seated. For those of you who have read the monthly Messenger, you may hear an echo of that in the sermon today. For those of you who have not, you may hear an echo of that in the sermon today. So I just want you to bear that in mind. Many of us have heard of the phrase of a black swan event. It dates back to the Roman times initially, when people would say it was as impossible as a black swan. And of course, that works out really well if there are no such things as black swans. Of course, it all came crashing down when explorers found black swans down in Australia towards the tail end of the Age of Discovery. This black swan discovery wasn't just a zoological oddity, but rather it was a profound shock to the worldview. It revealed the limitations of their experience, the fragility of their assumptions, and the reality that the world is often far more complex and unpredictable than any of us can imagine. We too live in these same frameworks, these same white swan assumptions. We build our lives on routines and expectations and a sense of control. We cling to the familiar even when it's inauthentic, because the unknown feels threatening. We convince ourselves that we have it all figured out, that our carefully constructed lives will shield us from the unexpected. We allow the mundane pressures of our daily lives to drown out the possibility of something extraordinary, something divine, intruding upon our lives. This clinging to the familiar, this convincing ourselves that we have it all figured out, and this mundane pressure of our daily lives, constantly, day in, coming, invading us, has probably led more people to sideline the gospel than any great thunderclap of reality. What happens when a black swan event disrupts our carefully laid plans? What happens when we encounter the divine, shattering our illusions and revealing a reality beyond our wildest imaginations? In today's gospel lesson, Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up on top of a mountain. And there they witness their own black swan event. Jesus' appearance is transformed. Moses and Elijah appear, and the voice of God thunders from a cloud. This encounter challenged everything they thought they knew about Jesus, everything they thought they knew about God, everything they thought they knew about nature and reality. Just like the discovery of the black swans, the transfiguration confronted the disciples with the fear of change, the illusion of control, and the overwhelming pressure of the mundane. Like the disciples or the people during the European age of discovery, we must ask ourselves deep questions. How will we respond when our own white swan assumptions are challenged by an encounter? An encounter with Christ, for instance, as he really is. An encounter with Christ not as we imagine him to be. Throughout Luke's gospel, there is a concept that God is intruding into the lives of people. The extraordinary comes into the ordinary and demands that we make a decision. Our passage here opens up by telling us that Jesus is going to pray, and he takes his disciples along with him. The disciples are ordinary individuals. They struggle to stay awake as they go up with Jesus. They are confronted with the extraordinary. And so they seek to contain and explain it in ways that would make sense for them by putting the holy in one particular segmented and segregated area so that they can keep it when it's convenient for them. The New Testament isn't some catalog of extraordinary heroes and super saints with abilities and righteousness far beyond the average person. It's not telling us of heroes with unwavering devotion to their cause. Instead, we find in its pages people like you and me, ordinary people, who cling to their ordinary lives because the call of God is so threatening to what they find so familiar. There was so much going on in Jesus' life and ministry. And yet he broke free of the pressures that he was facing, the things he was doing in order to go and pray to God. The disciples had seen the miracles take place, the things Jesus had done, the wondrous signs that he had performed. They had heard his teachings, the teachings of the Messiah, and yet they still felt the tug of sleep when they were in his presence. Peter didn't do something odd, but rather something you and I would do whenever we encounter the glory of God. When he was in the presence of God, he spoke before he listened. Everyone knew the Messiah would show up, in theory. But when the Messiah actually did show up, who was ready? The disciples had thought they had it all figured out while they were following after Jesus. You and I think we have it all figured out when we follow after Jesus. That is why there is so much talk these days about reducing Christianity to 100 little ideas that aren't having Christ at the center. We want to turn Christianity into moralism or virtue, to just being a good person regardless of the reason why you live a changed life. We think we know what swans look like, of course. They're meant to be white. That's what we tell ourselves. But when the black swan appears, we work like mad to try and figure out how to shield ourselves from this new information, from this revelation. We work so hard in domesticating Christianity to make it something that we can do. We have trouble standing in awe of it as it really is, or listening to the voice of God as He tells us what is happening. When we can't shield ourselves from the unexpected, we resort to trying to contain the unexpected within our own expectations. We human beings have built a nice little world for ourselves, we say to ourselves. When the Creator actually does show up, though, we try and find some place in our world for Him. Somewhere off to the side. Somewhere where we can visit when it's convenient for us, instead of allowing Him to intrude in our ordinary, mundane lives. It's true that throughout the Old Testament, God had permitted Himself to exist in the tabernacle or in the temple, wherever He decided to show up. But here, something else is happening. Peter probably was aware of this. He probably thought he would get a gold star from Jesus for saying exactly what he had learned in Sunday school. We all think the same, don't we? We think if we just say the right pretty words, God will love us more. I recall a story about a prayer gathering. And one gentleman gets up and says this beautiful prayer, long prayer, sits down. And the next person gets up, aware of his limitations, and just utters what's in his heart. Afterwards, the prayer that those people remembered was not the one with big words and florid speech, but the simple prayer uttered from the heart, the one that listened more than it spoke. God's purpose for God's people has always been the same. We have been set apart so that we can go out into the world, a world that is sometimes friendly, a world that is sometimes hostile. That doesn't change the fact that we are being set apart to be sent out into it. In our attempt to make God fit our mundane lives, we can miss the opportunity to experience His presence. We can miss the experience of the extraordinary, the experience of the divine. There will be black swan events that will happen in your life. They will cause you to have to let go of the familiar, to realize that you don't have it all figured out, and to allow the possibility that there is something extraordinary that has entered into your life, that has come down out of the heavens and into the mundane ordinariness of lived life. You and I can feel as if we are cheating, and that something so good shouldn't come to us without our working for it, without our expectations, without our preparing for it. It is important to note that we will have to come down from our own pride in order to go up to that mountaintop. And when we descend from the mountaintop, we will have to go into the wilderness as well. That wilderness is great. As I was preparing for this sermon, one of my favorite pastors to read spoke of how people get lost and focused on that wilderness. What we can do rather than what we have experienced. If you go into the wilderness on your own steam, with your own strength, you will be swallowed up by it. Don't forget that you are coming down from the mountaintop. We can't allow the wilderness to cause us to forget or to ignore the fact that we have had that mountaintop experience. That we go into the wilderness as people who have witnessed the presence of God. In our cynical age, where cynicism is the faith of the day, where blind skepticism is considered a badge of honor, the Christian proclaims that something amazing and extraordinary and indeed unexplainable has entered into our world, entered into our lives. Everyone had imagined the Messiah would be a swan like any other swan. The swan that we know of, a swan that we've seen 100 times before. But instead, he showed up as something completely different. An event that must change our lives after the experience. Our job is to rouse the weary world to the fact, to the revelation that heaven has broken into the world and that heaven is going about transforming the world into heaven's image. Amen.